how do you avoid this? To achieve a political and economic independence, and you decouple from dollar diplomacy, that requires a critical mass with enough countries in it so that they can together be self-sufficient in their own essentials. This didn't exist after World War II, when Europe and the rest of the world was devastated. It didn't exist even with the non-aligned group because the 5 countries weren't sufficient to become a bloc of their own. What's needed now is to not only to be financially independent, you need your own monetary system to create your own money, so that and as a public utility, so if debts rise, the government is a creditor, the government can write down the debt, as China does. You also need your own bank clearing system. There's a technology for transferring funds over the telephone or through banks, and America had worked through Luxembourg, sort of like the island of Delos or the sacred island of Delphi, site of Delphi. Luxembourg is supposed to be independent, and that had the SWIFT bank clearing system, but it really is part of the U.S. Pentagon. It's a military system where the U.S. can threaten to create financial havoc in Russia or other countries using it if all of a sudden you don't let any of their bank transfers take place. So other countries need to break free of the American and the European infrastructure, realizing that European is a satellite of the United States. It's the Europe has become a dead zone economically. It's being impoverished because its governments are not able to create their own money, to run their own budget deficits beyond 3% of GDP. So its governments are not able to pull their economies out of depression. They're not able to produce enough euros as public debt to become a rival vehicle for other countries to hold their central bank reserves. It can't rival the dollar. And the United States created Europe as a non-rival, as a satellite, as a dependent area. So the most recent grouping after the non-aligned group has been the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the group, the BRICS, an alliance of Russia, China, India, South Africa, and Brazil, with Iran as an associate. The ideal is to begin by being independent economically within yourself, so you don't need the U.S. market or U.S. suppliers. You can produce your own basic needs and let the United States be isolated. What's up for grabs is Europe. How long will European populations permit the utterly corrupt Social Democratic Party or the corrupt Labour Party or the corrupt Christian Democrats or the corrupt other parties of Europe to be arms of the United States State Department? How long will Europe let European politics be like Australian politics, simply doing whatever they're told by the US or Britain acting on behalf of the United States? If the rest of the world, the rest of Asia, Vietnam, other countries, China, can become wealthier and wealthier with their own resources, and together these countries have enough of their own resources to be independent, then you let the other world, as the United States is warmed, the American affluence means the flowing in from abroad. American affluence will dry up, because without the empire, America won't be able to drain other countries financially. Without the dollar area, without dependence on the US dollar, on US banks, on US bondholders as creditors, the United States will not be able to essentially get the free lunch that it's been able to get really ever since World War II, as we'll be discussing in the next lecture. So that what's required is sort of not only an international, to do this, is not only an international economic capability, but you need an ideology of international law and a foreign policy whose guiding principles are predicated on blocking rent extraction through monopoly privileges and through realizing that public infrastructure is a source of production. Every country needs to be self-sufficient in food. Every country needs to be self-sufficient with its own financial and banking system. It needs to be self-sufficient in essentials, or to have real allies that are not mutually exploitative, but realize if we don't support each other, we're going to be divided and conquered by the United States. So I think that a guiding legal principle to break out and to draw the third world, Africa and Latin America, into this new alternative to dollar diplomacy is that legal principle should be written into international law that no country should be obliged to pay foreign debt by forfeiting its own natural resources or monopolies or capital investment, and should not be required to cut back living standards of labor in order to pay its foreign debt. That the right of any independent nation is economic independence, not to let itself be impoverished by foreign creditors. In other words, countries that owe dollar debt would simply negate it as essentially odious foreign debt. This foreign debt was taken on under military and political force and by a deliberate U.S. warping of their development to push their balance of payments into deficit, requiring debt to American bondholders and the International Monetary Fund and bondholders among the client oligarchies of these countries. All these debts should be wiped out in order to wipe out the savings of the oligarchy faction, because what's at stake is a fight between democracy or socialism and oligarchy and militarized oligarchy. So throughout history, from classical Greece and Rome down to modern debtor countries, a common denominator of all democracy for 2,500 years has been debt cancellation and the ending of absentee land ownership. Democracies in Greece and Rome and subsequent Western countries did not achieve this. There was always pressure for it. There was revolutions for it. There were uprisings from it century after century, but democracy was never able to do it. The only place that was able to achieve this kind of debt cancellation and independence was through the Near Eastern rulers, from Hammurabi's Babylonia to the Neo-Assyrian and Babylonian and Persian empires in the first millennium BC. And rulers held the loyalty and support of their local populations by periodically proclaiming clean slates that annulled debts and liberated indebted bondservants and restored self-support land to debtors who'd forfeited to foreclosing creditors. This didn't occur in the West. So the West, whether it's democracy or oligarchy, never had that kind of debt cancellation. Western law, ever since Rome, has been built in to European and American law that creditors have rights that are overshadow the rights of actual owners who are indebted and the population as a whole. That the finance basically becomes the center of economic planning and of resource allocation by letting creditors be in charge of resource allocation and by having creditor-controlled governments that block any kind of public or democratic or socialist control over how the economic surplus is invested. So as a transition to the next lecture, the United States finances its military spending abroad and its related diplomacy by demanding that foreign countries guarantee a stipulated part of their grain markets or other markets to U.S. suppliers, and that they rely on U.S. banks and U.S. creditors for the money that they need to grow, instead of being in charge of their own markets and their own financing. Finance capitalism's mode of economic control is affected through monopoly privilege of creating money and credit domestically and abroad by U.S. banks that own foreign banks. No country should let foreigners own and control the banking system because banking credit is simply created electronically, and it extracts interest, and it sends the interest abroad, and it uses the interest proceeds to lend more and more against assets and to indebt the economy more and more. The ideal is, in order to be economically independent, you have to prevent the financial dynamic from growing and taking you over, as we'll be discussing in the fifth lecture of the series. The financial privilege that America has, the dollar privilege, is the capstone of U.S. international strategy. And it's the dollar's role not only as a dominant means of payments, but to run balance of payments deficits without limit by printing as many dollars as it wants to finance the costs of its military empire and political bribery and meddling and interference in foreign politics. So the financial privilege essentially is the capstone of preserving the dollar's dominant role, and in order to have an independent alternative, other countries need the money creation privilege to take it back into the public domain as a public infrastructure utility controlled to allocate its own income in a way that will help it grow to benefit its own population, not to benefit foreign investors from the United States or its satellites.